Buonasera signori e signori, buonasera e un caloroso benvenuto a tutti all'Accademia Britannica. Noi siamo particolarmente orgogliosi stasera di cominciare praticamente l'anno accademico dell'Accademia Britannica di Roma con una coppia di presentazione sul tema di sostenibilità. Penso che probabilmente la maggior parte del pubblico qui stasera è inglese, non vorrei fare più danno al linguaggio italiano, allora adesso torno in inglese se posso. It's a great pleasure to nearly begin the academic year of the British School at Rome with this paired presentation on the theme of sustainability and climate change. Yesterday we welcomed the superintendent of Pompeii, Massimo Osanna, to give an absolutely thrilling lecture here on the way that he, with collaborators, which include the British School at Rome, have addressed and tackled the challenges of one of the most difficult sites, archaeological sites in Italy and possibly in the world. And what was so thrilling about that was the way that Osanna, with the Grande Progetto Pompeii, has turned the attention to conservation and maintenance and stabilisation of the site against the huge challenges of what is thrown at that site on a daily basis, the vast numbers of tourists, the vast climatic challenges of a site which, after all, was destroyed pretty violently 2,000 years ago and dug up pretty aggressively over 200 years ago. So we've got a very strong theme on conservation and heritage management here at the British School at Rome, over years of work at Herculaneum and in many other sites. We've also, as an institution, as an academy, always had an eye to the way that our work has a broader relevance and a general application, whether that be history or archaeology, art history, or indeed the practice of art and the practice of architecture, which are critical parts of our charter mission. It's also, at the moment, a very key concern for us as an institution as we have set about a substantial programme of work to make the British School at Rome as a building more sustainable for its future. In 1916, nearly 100 years ago, the British School at Rome and this site opened its doors to residents for the first time. And next year we'll celebrate that centenary with a building which will have a newly constructed roof, a new constructed basement, a whole series of energy reducing measures which make the British School at Rome a more sustainable community for its future. And we've done that with the support of many sponsors, but I would wish today to acknowledge the support of the British Academy, which funded a pilot project to establish the scope of that project and then supported us in some of our fundraising. We're extremely grateful to the British Academy. And the British Academy, of course, is represented here this evening by the President of the British Academy, Lord Stern. And Lord Stern, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, as it is also to have the Chief Secretary of the British Academy, Alan Evans. Now, I'll do my introduction to Lord Stern in a moment. But when we started to think about how we could celebrate this occasion, we were delighted to be able to think about another major event in Italy, the Milano Expo, which is a major Italian achievement, a hugely significant cultural moment, which has as part of its activity the pavilion designed by Wolfgang Buttress. Given the accolade of being the British Pavilion just about a year ago at a ceremony which I remember very well at the Maxi. Wolfgang Buttress has had a glittering career. His awards are many and varied. He has worked in a number of countries: Australia, Chicago in America, Milan, Italy, Stoke-on-Trent, a whole range of projects, all of them characterised, I think, by an extraordinarily imaginative approach to design. We're extremely grateful to have you here, Wolfgang, because not only is it a matter of great pride for us to be able to welcome to our architectural community an architect who has done so brilliantly, but it's also wonderful to be celebrating another British occasion in the British School at Rome, a site partially designed by Edwin Lutyens. By the way, it's Edwin Lutyens, I believe, to whom we must attribute the blame for our roof. Apparently Lutyens was never able to build a roof that didn't leak. So there we are. Wolfgang Buttress will speak first, and his pavilion speaks to the whole topic of how we feed our world and how we sustainably maintain the environment in which we all live. Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, Baron Stern of Brentford, has of course made an enormous contribution to this debate. He's a British economist and academic, Professor of Economics and Government at the London School of Economics, and since 2013 President of the British Academy. He's best known for his extraordinarily important report on the economics of climate change, which for the first time really persuaded a huge proportion of the policymakers and decision makers of the world to take seriously the economic consequences of climate change. He'll be speaking at the Expo Milan on Saturday as part of a very high-powered panel to discuss, amongst other things, the upcoming COP, but also to draw further lessons from his book, Why Are We Waiting? The Logic, Urgency and Promise of Tackling Climate Change, which, if you have not already bought a copy, you may buy one from just outside at a discounted rate. There you are. But it's really a very, very important theme, it seems to me, for all of us to be able to tackle everything that we do, the sustainability of our institutions, the sustainability of our lives, the sustainability of our environments are such key themes that at the moment it's a great pleasure, therefore, for me to welcome both our speakers and also this audience, which includes, I know, representation from several museums, from Consiglio Nazionale della Ricerca, from the Accademia dei Lincei, and from many of the other academies in Rome. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us this evening. We'll take questions if there is time at the end. I hope there will be, but I will take non rubo più di tempo di questa presentazione. Adesso passo la parola con gran piacere a Wolfgang Buttress. Wolfgang, thank you.
Okay, buonasera. Can everybody hear me at the back? Is that okay? Yeah, my name's Wolfgang Buttress. I'm an artist based in Nottingham in the UK. And what I'd like to do is just talk for me 20-25 minutes. At first I'll talk about a couple of sort of sculptures which maybe have a relevance to the project which just completed in Milan. Then we'll talk a little bit about the ideas, how I came up with the ideas for the pavilion, then how we made it, and then a little kind of walk through about the actual experience itself. All my work is about context and how to celebrate and define a sense of place. Sometimes it's very easy to find, sometimes more difficult. This is a sculpture which I installed and created in Canberra at the Australian National University 2 years ago. It was in the new science department. They were all new buildings, and the idea was to reflect the context, to reflect the atmosphere, the change in light. And I worked with astrophysicist Dr. Daniel Bayliss, and what we did, we measured and mapped the 9,115 stars which you can see with your naked eye from Earth. Each of these stars is actually mapped as a perforation, and when you look through the perforation itself, inside the sculpture there's a 2-metre diameter stainless steel sphere which reflects the star map on the outside. So it's this idea of the microcosm, this idea that we're all made from stardust, and it's this connection between the sublime and the natural. Inside the piece itself there's a lot of hidden fibre optic lights, so it glows at night. So what happens, you have this idea of the intimate and the subtle. This is a piece which just got installed at the end of last year at the John Hancock Centre in Chicago. One of the interesting things about this building, amazing building, is that all the structure of the building itself is all on the outside. Working again with Dr. Daniel Bayliss, I created a sort of sculpture which maps all the stars you can see in the southern hemisphere. These are represented by tiny little glass, hand-blown sort of spheres, and it's actually a hemisphere. There's a mirrored ceiling, and on the floor you can see there a black granite pool with a very sort of thin film of water. So when you sit on the outside, on the edge of the pool, you have this sense of infinity, that again, you're connected to the stars. About January 2014, one of about 7 or 8 people working my practice in Nottingham, and one of the fellows, Tom Bennett, he said, "Are we going to apply for the competition for the Milan Expo this year?" I'm an artist, I'm not an architect. I thought it would be an amazing thing to do, but I was kind of sort of sceptical. There's a whole history of amazing sort of structures, from this piece here you can see from Buckminster Fuller to the Eiffel Tower to Paxton's original Crystal Palace. There's a whole history of spectacle, and I was talking to my wife, Joy, who's also an artist, and we sort of thought, well, if we're going to do something, how could you do something which really addresses the theme of the Expo this year, which is feeding the planets? How can you express this in a pavilion? The pavilion itself was a given. It was a 100-metre long clock by 15 metres wide, and my first idea was almost to take a section of the British countryside and take it over to Milan. I wanted it to be quiet, I wanted it to be sustainable, and I wanted to speak quietly, to have an impact, but to be completely immersive, so it would engage with all the senses. This is myself and some of the sort of team talking in the studio in Nottingham, and came up with the idea of using the idea and the metaphor of the honeybee. As you probably know, pollination is responsible for 30% of all the food that we eat, and the honeybee is probably the most important pollinator of them all. And the honeybee is in crisis for various reasons: pesticides, climate change, lack of biodiversity. The bee itself can almost be seen as a sentinel of the planet. They're exquisitely tuned to our environment. They haven't actually evolved for 140 million years, so they're kind of perfect. So the problem isn't the bee, the problem is with us as man. So I had this idea of using the bee, and somehow if we could use this as a sense of somehow we could get inside this to tell the sort of story about the problems that are facing the bee, it would be hopefully a wonderful thing to do. I was very interested in using the idea of the honeycomb, this idea of the structure which you'd sort of find within a hive itself, which again, architecture called Corbusier to Mies van der Rohe have used it. It's incredibly efficient, very effective and very beautiful. I wanted to use materials which would patinate naturally. I wanted to use landscape. 60% of the pavilion itself is landscape and trees which can be recycled. I was interested in using, rather than being a spectacle, a sense that you would be inside the piece, rather than just being look at it. All the senses would be engaged. And like all of my sort of sculptures, everything sort of starts with the drawing. So we started exploring, doing these sort of sketches, something very sort of simple. And I had this idea of having, at the end of this journey, at the end of this walk, there would be something delicate and ethereal, some kind of honeycomb sort of structure which would invite the audience to walk towards. Working in the sort of studio itself, we started putting this into digital format to try and give it some sort of sense. But what was really important to me, rather than it being a purely artistic impression of what a bee experiences and what a hive is, I was really keen to work with a scientist. And again, by pure chance and synchronicity, a friend of mine, Rian Solomon, introduced me to this amazing fellow called Dr. Martin Benchik, who's doing this incredible research into bees. And what he's doing, he's working at how bees not only communicate with themselves, but also to us as people. This is my first ever time I was actually put on a beekeeper's suit on. And I don't know whether you've actually done this yourself, but it's an incredible feeling. I felt really privileged. The first time I actually put the suit on and lifted up this slide of bees, I kind of thought it'd be kind of scary, frightening, but it wasn't at all. It was warm, it was invigorating, there was this low visceral hum, and I felt really kind of connected with the bees and to the earth itself. These are the sort of sounds which you usually associate when you hear of bees. It's a zzz, this sort of sound. But what Martin's actually been doing with his kind of research is trying to find out how bees communicate. And how he does this, he puts these tiny little things inside the beehive itself called an accelerometer. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. So this little thing here, and this accelerometer measures vibrations. If you put a microphone inside a beehive, what happens very sort of quickly, the bees will think it's an alien invader and cover it in propolis. But by putting an accelerometer on into the bees just don't know what's happening. They can put the propolis around it, and it still emits its signals. This is a typical day in a beehive. You can sort of see in the morning, it's very sort of quiet. They're very much like us, bees. In the morning, they're quite sort of quiet and sort of calm. It kind of comes to the afternoon, they get hungry, they kind of come back. And you can sort of see how the energy here, expressed as red, is made. And what I thought would be really interesting is to somehow try and express these digital signals in real time in the pavilion in Milan. These are some of the sounds which actually are coming from inside the hive. Martin digs really deeply inside these sort of signals, and this is the quacking sound, and it's the sound of two queen bees, a virgin bee, which is virgin queen, which is just about to be born, and a virgin bee which is actually inside the hive, and it's a fight to the death. And it's incredibly powerful, kind of haunting sound. So the idea was to incorporate, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button, is to integrate science and art with science on the one side to come together with art. So what we did, we have these live signal, this live digital feed, which kind of comes from a real beehive in Nottingham and Brackenhurst, and that's expressed as light. So you can see here we've mapped out a 14-metre sort of cube. Each one of those circles represents a light, and the more energy which is happening in the beehive, the more energy is expressed as light. One of the things, this works really well at night time and in the evening, but in the day when we have this very sort of strong Milanese sun, I still wanted this sort of sense of immersion, this sort of sense that people could be sort of transported and the bees were actually talking to each other and to us. So I asked a couple of my friends who play in a band called sort of Spiritualised, and Camille and Deirdre Benchik, and what we did, we transmitted a live feed of bees into the recording studio. We found out that the bees themselves actually are in the key of D. So Deirdre started playing her cello along, and it was just the most amazing sort of sound. We detuned it so it was an octave deeper than what you usually have, and it was just this incredible, rich, sonorous kind of music. And what I decided to do, which I thought could be a nice idea, is that it could be the bees who actually generate the soundscape. It wouldn't be man, as is usually the sort of case, which kind of dominates. It would be the bee talking. So what we had various noise gates, and at certain frequencies it'll open up a noise gate, and it'll open up a pre-recorded stem of a violin or a mellotron or a guitar or a voice. So it's when you're actually in the pavilion itself, it's like the bees are talking to you. It completely changes all the time. It's very much like nature. Nature is always moving, it's always sort of fluid, so it would be completely changing all the time. What's going to happen sort of subsequently is that Heavenly Records have taken up the soundscape and the soundtrack and released it in January in the UK. And what I'd like to do now is just show you very quickly how we actually made the Hive. We won the competition in May 2014. Ordinarily this would be a project which would maybe take 2 years to do. It was a really concentrated process. worked with this amazing structural engineer called Tristan sort of Simmons, and it was almost like a Darwinian sort of process of making the whole of the process incredibly sort of simple and efficient. What I wanted to do was have this sort of sense of chaos. What is beautiful about a hexagon in the honeycomb is that each one of the hexagons is very, very slightly kind of different. So it was a case of this is the first iterations of the hive. There's 170,000 different parts which actually contribute to the actual hive itself. And this is how we made it in York. It was done by a company called Stage 1, who are responsible for building the last seven serpentine pavilions, as well as doing the torch for the Olympics a few years ago. Amazing company. We made the whole of the sort of structure out of aluminium. It's incredibly strong, incredibly light, and we only had a 1 millimetre sort of tolerance to making it. So we didn't use any heat. So everything was machined or water jet cut. This is the first sample that you can sort of see up in York. All of the rods themselves were all machines. I asked sort of Tristan in terms of the brief. I just wanted each one of these rods to be sort of thicker than my finger. And this is us on site. Probably December 2014, and you can start seeing how the piece was kind of put together. It took 20 men 3 months to put together, and very sort of slowly but sort of surely the hive starts to take shape. And what's interesting is how we've tried to get this sort of synthesis between the energy and what happens in a real beehive and what happens in the hive over in Milan. This is Kevin right at the end, who's put the last piece of the rod right at the end, and you start having this sort of sense of the micro and the macro, how we're all kind of connected. From afar you see this almost kind of chaotic sort of swarm of metal. You don't really have a sort of sense of how it's kind of constructed until you kind of get closer up to it and you sort of see the structure and it's revealed for what it is. So this is the first sort of shot of ourselves actually in the pavilion, beginning of this year. Sometimes in life you have these epiphanies, and there was myself, Dr. Martin Benchik, the architects, the landscape architects and the musicians, and when the scaffolding finally kind of came down, we had a sense of kind of what we'd achieved really. The sound was there, the lights were there, and it was a really amazing feeling. And then we kind of woke up the next day and we kind of realised that it was quite terrifying. In 2 weeks' time, the whole of the eyes of the world would be kind of on us, and it was, oh my goodness, what have you done? Thankfully, the world, the world's press have been very kind to us. So what I'll quickly go through now is to show you the journey through the actual kind of pavilion itself. And then maybe at the end of the talk, after Lord Stern's talking, perhaps we can have a bit of a conversation and answer some questions. So conceptually, it's very sort of simple. You can sort of see we start in the orchard, we go through a meadow into the hive, so that the actual visitor takes the journey very much how a bee would. This was mapped out by BDP, the landscape architects, and everything kind of comes from this sort of central oculus. Over in Milan, the only constant thing I knew would be the sky. I had no sense of what our neighbours would be. So it seemed to me that this sort of sense of hope, this sort of sense of the sort of sky, could in a way be the kind of fulcrum of everything that I was trying to do. One starts in at the beginning in the orchard. These are apple trees here in the beginning, which are only ever pollinated by the honeybee. And I was really conscious I didn't want to have a load of video screens or a lot of words. I wanted it to be kind of quiet so we could kind of talk to people gently. There are some small little sort of screens you can sort of see there, but they're tiny, like little holes, and they're almost like a bee hotel. So you look into them and it shows the drawings, a little animation which tells the story of the journey that you're going to go through. One of the big ideas that I kind of came up with was a simple idea, but in a way, usually when you're in nature as man, you're actually on top of nature, you're trampling on top of the grass, what I was kind of keen to do was kind of raise nature to this level. So when you're walking through the pavilion, you're at the same level as a honeybee. So hopefully you feel connected to nature, but also perhaps a little bit of humility. It was one of the most amazing things when the actual meadow started to take place. We worked with some amazing architects, landscape architects in Kew Gardens who specified the plants. And then this is the hive coming through tonight, and you can sort of see here the idea that we're playing here with the idea of the micro and the macro, but people actually look like honeybees when you're kind of close to it. And at night time it takes on its own special characteristics. Underneath the hive itself we have these things where people can kind of go up, and rather than having speakers telling the sort of story, this information is actually is expressed through bone conduction. So you go up, you get a tiny little stick, you put it into one of those reeds, and the vibration from the reed goes into your head, and your head actually acts like a sort of speaker. Bees themselves are deaf, so it's a way of communicating like the bees. This is looking inside the hive itself, and when you're underneath this, you have this real sense that you're enveloped. Underneath the hive, it changes all the time, from night through to the day. And what we tried to do here was actually work with nature rather than against it. It's a lot warmer in Milan than the UK, and on the really hot days, even sort of 40 degrees, it was always 3 or 4 degrees cooler inside the hive than outside. Because of the oculus which you have at the centre here, it actually acts like a chimney and brings warm air right through it, so you sort of feel kind of cool and connected to nature. You stand on a glass floor which kind of feels precarious, but you feel alive, you feel connected. One of the really lovely things which we've been doing as part of this process is not only kind of meeting a lot of amazing Italian engineers and architects, but it's some of the sort of spin-off ideas which have come through. This was done at the probably May of this year, and what we did here was again trying to work with the bees, work with science. This is Dr. Martin Benchy, and we put some lemongrass actually inside the cello, and we thought if we could actually create a new environment for the bees themselves in this place called Langer Hall. So we collected a swarm of bees. You can sort of see us putting the bees actually inside the cello itself. We were a little kind of nervous just to make sure that would the queen bee actually get inside the cello, because the queen bee itself, you probably know, is slightly bigger than the rest of the bees, but we couldn't actually sort of see it. Like here's 45,000, 50,000 bees that actually made their new home. And you can see in a minute the actual honeycomb they start to make through one of the F-holes, which is in there. So the plan now is for next year to work again with the same musicians who created the soundscape, is to have a live performance starting there in Langer Hall, where the bees are the pavilion should be. In a way, it's a one sort of simple idea, and hopefully we've on the way thrown like a little pebble into a pool, and you don't really know where those ripples are going to go. We're anticipating 1 million visitors, which will go through the pavilion, and I think we're up to 2.9 million visitors already. It's been a lovely project. I love working in Milan. It's been lovely speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that absolutely thrilling presentation of a truly remarkable British achievement. Thank you so much. I'd like, just before we move to Lord Stern's presentation, to offer a very sincere vote of thanks to the British Embassy in Rome, which has worked with us substantially through the whole planning of this, not only this occasion here, but also a second occasion in the European University Institute in Florence, in association with the British Institute in Florence, but also the Embassy and BSR sponsored event at Milan Expo. I'm very grateful to the Ambassador, Christopher Prentice, who's joined us now, and all of his team for the enormous amount of work they put in. And so it's a very great pleasure on behalf of the Ambassador and myself to welcome Lord Stern to talk to us. Why are we waiting?
Well, first of all, Gang, that was absolutely tremendous. I'm like everybody else. I was sitting there just in wonder, and it's a testimony to why I think we need so many ways of looking at things. And what you're going to get in a moment from me is the reaction of an economist, social scientist, to the difficulties of thinking about big issues like the future of the planet and the world, and being able to feed the world and so on. And a month ago I was here for a get-together organised by one of the think tanks around the Vatican, and the next day we met the Pope. And again, the language he used to capture the ideas we're talking about was again a very special talent. You know, he talked about the globalisation of indifference, and he said, God always forgives, people sometimes forgive, and nature never forgives. So the ability to conceptualise and capture some of the big ideas is a special talent, and the way in which you captured a big idea, but you didn't just capture it, you made it something. I was just sitting in wonder, so thank you, thanks very much. One thing I can be confident of is that I will be doing something completely different. Let me also thank the British School at Rome and the Embassy here for organising all this. I've already begun to enjoy myself and learn things, and I'm sure that will continue over these next 3 days. What I'm going to do is, of course, ask the question, why are we waiting? It's a rhetorical question. It says that we shouldn't be waiting, and I'll give the argument for that, and that's why I call it the logic, urgency and promise of tackling climate change, and that's what I'll take us through. We have slides here. I'm not going to go through all the slides, but I am going to, probably about half of them. I hope that it will be all right to have the slides on the website of the British School at Rome and the British Embassy, so that anybody who wants to download the slides will be able to do so. They're public goods, they're for recycling. But also those of you who are moved to buy the book and spend a long time reading it will get the full version that way. But what I'm going to do is to go a bit beyond the book, because as you just heard, and you know anyway, we're running up to a big meeting in Paris end of November, beginning of December this year, where the world is going to try to come, and probably will come to an agreement on climate change. So I'm quite closely involved in that as a friend of the chair of Laurent Fabius, the French foreign minister, who's chairing the COP, and also there's a strategy committee for the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres, and I'm directly involved there as well. That doesn't mean I speak for anybody other than myself. My views on this are not the views of the LSE, they're not the views of the British Academy, they're my views, and I'm very happy to discuss them. So, I'm going to set this whole story in the context of economic development. Economic development is what I've done all my professional life. In many parts of the world, particularly Africa and India, the most strongly in India, and for 40 years and for a quarter of a century in China as well. So I look at these issues from the point of view of trying to understand economic development. And what I want to emphasize right from the beginning and all the way through, that economic development, overcoming poverty on the one hand, and climate responsibility, managing climate change on the other, are intimately intertwined. So that's the story, or at least that's the framework for everything that I have to say. And it's absolutely crucial to this, the understanding of the whole set of challenges that we face. So let me start by encapsulating that in a very direct way. And essentially, I think for many of us, the two defining challenges, certainly for me, the two defining challenges of this century are overcoming poverty and managing climate change. And if we fail on one, we fail on the other. I'll shortly be emphasising just how big the risks of climate change are. If we don't act pretty quickly, we risk creating an environment that's so hostile that it would undermine and set back the great achievements, and there have been great achievements in development over the last 4 or 5 decades. On the other hand, if we try to manage climate change by putting obstacles, or being perceived to put obstacles in the way of development over the next 2 or 3 decades, we will not have the international coalition which we must have if we're to manage climate change. So if we fail on one, we fail on the other. Well, the good news, that's in many ways the logic of climate change, the logic in my subtitle. The good news is that if we're increasingly being able to see now just how we put those two things together. Promoting economic development, managing to overcome poverty, whilst at the same time managing climate change. And as we do that, we see that this is an extraordinarily attractive way to advance economic development. It's a much better way to consume and produce and grow than we have managed in the past. It's a much more attractive. So not only do we have to do them together, but when we look closely at what's involved, we can see how attractive it is. Certainly attractive relative to the kind of path that we've followed in the past. The urgency part of the story is that these next 20 years are absolutely critical. I'll explain that at some length, but essentially the world is urbanizing very rapidly. We will, over the next 3 or 4 decades, come close to doubling the population in our cities. Many countries in the world are going through levels of income which mean that the demand for energy is quite high, and we're building those energy systems. It's a critical period for looking after protecting our forests and our soils. So this next 2 or 3 decades will be absolutely vital for determining whether we're able to manage climate change. That's why it's urgent, because it's set in the context of a world which is transforming and transforming quickly, and where the investments associated with that transformation will be made one way or the other. So the issue is, and that's the urgency, will we over these next 20 or 30 years make those investments well, or make those investments badly? Well, that's the broad story, and I'll set Paris in that context, and I'll argue that we will get an agreement in Paris. It will be an agreement that, at least in the early years, falls short of what's necessary to hold to temperatures of 2 degrees. So the test of whether or not Paris is a success is what we put in place for accelerating agreement after Paris. So the test of good agreement in Paris is the path it sets for the acceleration of ambition. Well, that's my talk. The rest is detail, but I'll try and take you through that detail reasonably quickly. In many ways, it's a very worrying tale, but in many ways, it's a very cheerful tale. And the question is, how do you turn the worrying into the cheerful. And we can see how to do it, but there's a big question as to whether we will. But unless you can describe what you can do, you don't have any chance of coming to a place where people will do. So this is the story that I'll take you through. I've really already taken it through you in a as Wolfgang spoke about the macro and the micro. I've given you the macro argument. Now I'm going to get in a bit of the micro argument, but that's the structure which I've already described essentially. So it's worth reminding ourselves of the science, because the science really dictates what sort of problem we've got. This is 200-year-old science. Fourier discovered nearly 200 years ago that there was an issue because he looked at the heat balance, heat going in, heat going out, and the world was a good deal warmer than he thought it should be by just looking at the basic inflows of energy and outflows of energy. So he concluded that something was trapping, and he was right. By the middle of that same century, John Tyndall, Irish scientist, experimentally started to identify the gases that were doing the trapping. And then by the end of the century, Elsazera, a Swedish chemist, started doing back-of-the-envelope calculations as to just how big these effects might be. And he did quite well, actually. By the early part of, or really towards the middle of the last century, as we saw, did I just say Elsazera? I should have said Arrhenius was the Swedish chemist. By the middle of the last century, Elsazera, who's a quantum mechanist, a physicist, worked out how that process worked. And essentially, the oscillation, the frequency of the oscillation of the greenhouse gases interferes with the infrared energy, which is emitted from the Earth's surface. It comes in as solar energy, goes back as infrared, as it's reflected off the Earth's surface, and the greenhouse gases oscillate at a frequency which interferes. So that really defines what's a greenhouse gas and what's not a greenhouse gas. It's the frequency of their oscillation of a kind that interferes with the infrared. So that was a story of good science developing the basic principles being established, and after that the data started piling in. So this wasn't science in search of the data, this was good science being built up, and then the data coming through ever more powerfully to validate that science. The science itself tells us this is a story of risk. We can't predict exactly what will happen, but we can look at the kinds of things that are more or less likely to happen. Just as if you throw a six-sided dice, then you can ask yourself the question, well, you can say we don't know what will happen, but we can guess, or at least suggest, or work out, or establish that the average will be 3.5. Yeah? And average of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah? It's 3.5. So we can say something about what might happen. We certainly wouldn't want to suggest that because we don't know what will happen, we might as well assume the answer is 1. That's an argument actually you hear very frequently. It's obviously mad, but essentially that's the essence of alarm. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, so we might as well assume that almost nothing will happen. And that's clearly wrong. But what I want to emphasise is this is a story of risk. I've shown a moment it's a story of massive risk, and that it's a story that comes through with lags, and it's a story which depends on the sum total of what we all do, not just on what one person does. So the science has made it as about difficult as you can to make economic policy. It's uncertain, and humans are not very good at dealing with uncertainty. It's outside the range of what we've ever experienced before as human beings, way outside that we're talking about. Comes through with lags, and it's the sum total of what we do, not just what one person does. That's about as difficult as it could be from the point of getting people together around economic policy. But that's what the science has thrown at us. And I complain to my scientific friends, but it's not their fault, that's the That's the science. So that's the essence of the problem. We are, so what's doing the trapping is the concentrations of greenhouse gases. We're now around 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. That's, you add the other gases in on top of the CO2, and you do it in terms of equivalent CO2. We're adding about 2.5 parts per million a year. So 450 parts per million where we are now, adding 2.5 parts per million a year, that's still rising. So business as usual could easily add 300 parts per million in 100 years or so. Over 100 years, it's 2.5 now, that's rising. So you're adding 2.5 or 3 or more a year if you run that forward. So for 100 years, that might be 300 parts per million, that might be 750 parts per million 100 years or so from now. I mean, that's a bit of modelling, but it's arithmetic and pretty obvious. If we got to 750 parts per million, we're probably heading for somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees centigrade. And all this is average global surface temperature measured, increase in that, measured relative to the end of the 19th century, which is the usual benchmark before hydrocarbon powered growth really got going. We haven't been at 4 degrees probably for tens of millions of years. We haven't been at 3 degrees for 3 million years. The Holocene, this last 10,000 years where our societies developed, have been plus or minus 1, very tight range. And that's where the societies where, we started cultivating cereals, so we stuck around to wait for the cereals to grow, so we became more stationary, and we had a surplus, so we could have universities and the British Academy and the British School of Rome. You didn't have to spend all day hunting and gathering. So it's this period where we became what we are, a period of 9 or 10,000 years, during which the temperature was incredibly stable, plus or minus 1. We're on the edge of that now. 2 degrees will be way outside that period, and then 3 degrees we haven't seen for 3 million years. We've been around as Homo sapiens maybe 250,000, quarter of a million years. But basically it's the last 9 or 10,000 years that's seen us in the civilizations we are now. This part of the world at 3 or 4 or 5 degrees could be like the Sahara Desert. Other parts of the world would be underwater, Bangladesh, Florida and so on. Most of the snows will have gone off the big ranges, like the Himalayas and the Andes and the Rockies and the Alps, which drive, as it were, the water flows and the water structures. So in other words, the reasons for living where we live would be redrawn. We live where we live because of the ports, the structure of the rivers and where you can cross them. We live where we live because of the hospitality of the climate, where they are being battered all the time by hurricanes. Of course, they would get more and more severe because they take their energy from the sea temperature. The sea temperature goes up, they take up much more energy, and they become much more violent. The reasons you live where you live would be changed radically. Hundreds of millions, probably billions, would have to move. And you're talking about, in that picture, severe conflict. And the reasons for the conflict couldn't be turned off. You can't do a peace treaty with a climate that you've changed so radically. So, I've told a story that has the long legs, I've told a story that has the uncertainty, and I've told a story which is way outside human experience. So, we've given ourselves quite a difficult policy problem. The laws of physics and our use of hydrocarbons have given ourselves quite a difficult policy problem. So that's the basic story, that's the basic logic, that's what we have to deal with. And what I want to do now is to talk about, I've talked about the scale of the problem, I want to talk very quickly about the scale of the action, and then I'll go on to what we actually do about it. So I promised to give you about half the slides. What I have to do is make sure I give you the right half of it. So there we are. I've spoken about the process, but now I want to crystallise that into another point, which are the dangers of delay and the urgency. Now, I've spoken about a flow-stop problem. The flows of emissions go into the concentrations in the atmosphere. It's a flow stock question. I'd like the flow into the bathtub and the level of the bathtub. That's a flow stock issue. But it's the concentration, the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that does that gives you the greenhouse effect. It's that which prevents the energy leaving. It's that which warms up. So when you've got a flow stock problem, the later you leave the starting of serious action, the higher is the stock that you start with, and that makes it much more difficult. So one reason that it's so urgent and there are dangers of delay is that flow stock problem, together with the point I've already made that we start in a very difficult position already at the edge of what we've been experiencing in the Holocene period. But there's a second reason why delay is dangerous, particularly when you see very fast transformation in the world economy, a lot of investment going on. There's a great danger of lock-in. You lock in difficult cities, you lock in polluting energy systems, and they last for 20 or 30 years. Indeed, the structure of the cities, which is so important to this story, last on the whole a lot longer than that. Lutyens, since that's where we are, Lutyens laid out New Delhi around 100 years ago, and the new layout of New Delhi is just what it was, and the layout of New Delhi will stay that way. That's South Delhi. In fact, the layout of North Delhi comes from much earlier times, and that too is what it was for hundreds of years. So we know just how strong those lock-ins can be. That's why it's so important to act quickly. The effects come through very fast from the point of view of history of climate, 50, 100 years. They come through very slowly in political lifetimes. And that sense of urgency is not yet sufficiently in the discussion, in my view. So we have to act quickly, and what is the scale of action we have to take? Well, we're already so high and going higher. If you look at the numbers promised for Paris for 2030, that's going to come in above the 50 billion ton CO2 equivalent we're emitting as a flow each year. It's going to come in 55, maybe more. We're 50 now. A 2-degree path for 2030 would look more like not 55, it would look more like 40. So we should be dropping about 20% from 50 down to 40 in the next 15 years for a 2-degree path. We look like we're going to go up 10 or 15%. So that means, because what matters is the total over time, if you're high now, you've got to be low later, because it's the total over time that builds up in the atmosphere. So to get a reasonable chance of 2 degrees, we've got to get zero net emissions as a world by the end of the century. That means we've got to be negative in some places because it's going to be positive in other places. Well, we can do that. You can store carbon in the soil. You can regrade and regrade your forest and reforest. That pulls carbon, CO2 out of the atmosphere. You can do biofuels with carbon capture and storage. And there's some smart people experimenting with pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere more mechanically. Now that fourth way of doing it I regard as pretty speculative. But the other ways of doing it are not speculative. But there is a big question about whether we could do those on a sufficiently big scale. But we're going to need to get to zero emissions from electricity as a world by the middle of the century. That's the scale of what we have to do, given where we are now and given where we're going, it seems, in the next 15 years. And if you just do the arithmetic, you can burn uncaptured less than half of the established hydrocarbon reserves and keep a reasonable chance of holding to 2 degrees. So just take the reserves that we know about. Ask what happens when you burn them. That's just the basic chemistry and physics of turning hydrocarbons into heat by burning or electricity on the heat on the way, and look at the CO2 that comes out the other end, and look at the CO2 that we've got available, if we're to hold 2 degrees, the amount that we can emit, and it's about half of what we already know that can be burnt uncaptured. So this is the scale. Different ways of looking at the scale of what we have to do. Another way of looking at it, we have to cut emissions per unit of output, probably by a factor of 7 or 8 by mid-century. Now, all the things I've described are hard to do, but all I'm doing is giving the arithmetic. What is it that we would need to do for a reasonable chance of holding to 2 degrees, given that going beyond 2 degrees really is dangerous in terms of tipping points, instabilities, irreversibilities, and so on. You could see, going beyond 2 degrees, the permafrost starting to thaw and releasing lots of methane. That's just one example. You could see the ice sheets sliding off at both poles, which would give, if ice sheets slide off, that goes from land ice to sea ice, you get very rapid changes in sea level. If seas warm up, that process is much slower. That does inexorably lead you to much higher sea levels, but when the world was last at 2 degrees, sea level was probably about 6 metres higher than now. Well, that would leave London and underwater a fair way, the distance between London and Oxford. Right? That is very big, but that happens slowly. But ice sheets sliding off could increase very quickly. So the reason people talk about 2 degrees, it's not just some number snatched out of the air. It's that going beyond that, you see those tipping points, those irreversibilities, start to look increasingly threatening. So we've got big risks, and we have to make big adjustments. Well, now the cheerful side of the story begins, because when we ask what happens when we try to grapple and make with that issue, make those changes with the speed that this logic requires, you get into now, this is a story of what happens when we experience very rapid changes of technology, or what can happen when we experience very rapid changes in technology. Don't worry how to measure the vertical axis. This is a sketch, it's a diagram. But basically, if you look at past waves of technological change, starting from the second half of the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution associated with the mechanization of textiles, and go on to the 19th century. In the middle of that was dominated by steam and railways. End of the 19th century, steel and electricity. Beginning in the 20th, oil, automobiles and mass production. And now, at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st, we're in a remarkable period. Architectural change the world's ever seen. We've got 3 big waves of technological change going on at the same time, possibly more, but we've got the digital, we've got the materials, what we can do with materials is changing enormously quickly, and we've got the biotech as well. And this is a period then where we have technologies coming through incredibly rapidly, and at the same time, if we look back in economic history, we see that when we do start to move very rapidly, we see a few decades of innovation, investment and growth. So the first part of the story, having said how fast we have to change, leads directly into, well, what happens when you try to change technologies very quickly? And let me just note that Toyota announced yesterday that they expect to make hardly any conventional internal combustion engine cars by mid-century. So it's starting, and when we did the Stern Review 10 years ago, began to work on it 10 years ago, I think none of us anticipated just how fast the technologies could change. Since we started work, the cost of the solar panel has dropped by a factor of 10. Storage has started to become serious. So we could see this kind of cheerful story of very rapid technological change. So that's a positive part of the story. Another positive part of the story is that we would get rid of so much of what is damaging about burning hydrocarbons. So much of what is damaging immediately. Essentially, burning hydrocarbons kills people now. It kills a bit over 3 million a year from external air pollution, and a bit over 3 million, perhaps a good deal, over 3 million from internal air pollution. We're able to see that much better now because we've got, in terms of external air pollution, much better satellite observation over the last 5 or 10 years about where PM 2.5 and other particulates, where they are. 2.5 is smaller than 10. In the past we've concentrated on PM10, but PM 2.5 is much smaller, and that is not just in cities, it gets blown about on the winds. So the whole of the east coast of China sees quite high levels of PM 2.5, even though other air pollutants are much more concentrated locally. But there's a very good study from Berkeley Earth about 2 months ago, based on data which Chinese were collecting on local air pollution, and which concluded that air in Chinese cities is equivalent to smoking about 40 a day, man, woman and child, and it's very hard to avoid it, and the children suffer permanent damage. Those of you who have ever given up smoking, I never smoke very much, but those of you who have ever given up smoking could, if you survive the next 3 or 4 years, think that after 3, 4, 5 years you were probably all right relative to most of the effects that come to children. That's not true. China is much worse. China is much better than India. The pollution levels in India are, something like a dozen of the top 25 most polluted cities are in India. In the UK, the Supreme Court accepted a few months ago the calculation that around 30,000 people a year are killed by air pollution in the UK. This is not just China and India. 1,700 people are killed each year from road accidents. 1,700, about 15 times more are killed by air pollution. So I've said that this is a cheerful story, this rapid change, because of all the innovation and investment and growth that will come through. It's also a cheerful story. If we make that change, we would stop killing people now. We're killing them, I gave the best estimates of the numbers. I'm focusing on China just because the data are a bit better, because the Chinese have been measuring more carefully recently. So that's the second reason why this change could be so attractive. Let me turn to what we have to do, and that's the falling price of solar. But let me turn to what we have to do. An awful lot of what I've described, the change we have to make, our changing cities, our changing energy systems, investing in soil and forest, an awful lot of that is associated with infrastructure. Very crudely, we will see investment in infrastructure in the world, which is about $3 trillion a year, when world GDP 75 or 80 trillion, so it's quite a lot. The investment in infrastructure around the world, rich countries, poor countries, is around $3 and a bit trillion a year. Through that process of urbanization, which I described, through the process of investing in energy systems, you would expect to see that rise to, we don't know exactly, but over the next 15 years, $5 trillion or more per annum of infrastructure investment. The key question is whether we do it well or whether we do it badly. That's the most important determinant. Infrastructure in our cities, infrastructure in our energy systems. That's the most important determinant of how well we're going to do in handling this. What determines good infrastructure? Well, government policies are extremely important. The biggest deterrent to investment around the world is government-induced policy risk. These infrastructure investments in particular, 20, 30, 40, 50 years or longer, in their lifetimes, you can't be sure what's going to happen to your investment over 30, 40, 50 years, but governments can make it more uncertain or they can make it less uncertain. And it's not just the policy themselves, it's the administrative and legal structures and institutional structures in which that's placed. But there's a lot we can do to reduce that risk, and there's a lot we can do to bring much lower cost investment for financing those investments. City of Chicago can borrow probably at 100 or so, maybe 1% real. City of Sao Paulo probably has to pay 8% real. That's a huge deterrent to investment if you're going to have to borrow at those kinds of rates. And it's a huge tilt away from renewables, because renewables are much more capital intensive than other things, because you get the fuel, the sunshine or the wind, you get that for free. But of course you have to build the capital in order to do it. So this structure of interest rates is not some boring old thing that departments of economics and finance talk about or they whisper on about in the city. This is of enormous importance to the scale of investment and to the structure of that investment, because high real costs of capital facing investors tilt away from capital intensive investment. Now there's lots we can do to do something about that, and that's what some of my research has been on in the last year or so. I've only got time to make the point in a very general way, but it's fundamental. We've got to ramp up infrastructure, we've got to make it investment, we've got to make it cleaner. You're going to have you're going to need good policies to do that, and you're going to have to change the financial system so that that can happen. I was chief economist of two development banks, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank, and those are one kind of institution that can bring down risk and bring down the cost of capital. Other ways of doing it too, but if we're talking about implementation, and I didn't want to say what we had to do and say nothing about implementation, those are the kind of places that we have to look. So I've done 3/4 of what I needed to do. Let me finish with Paris. Now, Paris is COP21. It is the 21st conference of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you might say, well, so why do you expect to get something in the 21st when you maybe didn't get that far up to now? I haven't been to all 21, but I've been to all of them since 2006. And you do sometimes wonder where it's all going to get to. But let me try to suggest why we'll get somewhere this time. And we didn't get very far. We did get some distance, but we didn't get very far when we tried in Copenhagen in 2009, COP15. COP15 was quarrelsome, chaotic, badly prepared, and really cold, which doesn't put people in a good mood. But basically it was badly prepared. People hadn't got together to work out what could happen. You can't get nearly 200 countries together and say, well, we've got a week or two, let's sort it out. You have to prepare these things carefully in advance, and diplomats know all about that. But we've got much better preparation this time around, because essentially we've been looking at it for 3 years. We have the experience of Copenhagen behind us, and at Lima last year, very well run by the Peruvians, a lot of the basics of the structure were nailed down. So first, it's much better prepared. Second, the politics has changed. It's changed for a number of reasons, but a big part, I can't go into them all, but a big part of it is the increased understanding between the US and China. That doesn't mean they've stitched it up. They haven't done, and they shouldn't. They can't. But it sure does make a big difference to have the United States and China pushing in the same direction versus the United States and China pushing in different directions. And that's a reason why we'll do better. Another reason we'll do better is, a third, is that the understanding that we can have better growth, better climate, we can have climate responsibility and working to grow and overcoming poverty at the same time. The understanding of that has deepened. All too often you've had an artificial horse race between growth on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other. If it turns into that, climate responsibility will lose. But what we've begun to understand much better is how you put those things together. And fourthly, we've seen, for the reasons I did try to just describe, for example, in air pollution and in falling costs of technologies, we've seen that much of what countries need to do from the point of view, a global perspective of climate change, is actually in their own self-interest. So all these reasons are reasons why there's a chance a good chance we'll do better. So I'm convinced that the chances of getting agreement are very high, but the issue, as I said right at the beginning, is how fast we will be able to ramp up. So this is my penultimate slide. I've already said that there's a big gap between the sum total of the promises of where people are likely to go in 2030 and where we would need to be for 2 degrees. So the test of success in Paris is not whether people sign up to something. I think they probably will. The test is whether the content of what they sign up to will be sufficiently convincing about the acceleration of ambition after Paris. What will they say about the long-term goals? Will they recognise the gap between what's been promised and what we need for 2 degrees? I think the answer to that is yes. But will they go forward and say, and recognise the scale of what we have to do? They might say this is a big gap between what we've promised and 2 degrees, but never mind, we're beginning, we're on our way. And that is naivety. It's much better than where we would otherwise have been. But at the same time, there has to be a recognition more than that. There has to be a recognition of the scale of change that we have to make. Now, the G7 summit earlier this year in Germany, it was recognised explicitly that we have to decarbonise the world economy by the end of the century. That kind of long-term goal is an important part of the credibility of ramping up. But of course, it's not just recognising where we need to be in terms of emissions 60, 70, 80 years from now. It's also recognising what we have to do to accelerate progress now. That means we have to agree to work together much more strongly on technology. It means we have to do much more together on finance. It means that business, cities, NGOs are going to have to work together as well. All these things are being knitted, or being put together around Paris. The test will be how good they look, or how good there is there good reason to believe in them. So the last thing that I want to say is to just begin the discussion of how do you work to build up mutual confidence in each other, and confidence in the technologies, understanding of what you need to do, understanding of why in many cases directly in your own best interest, even if you never heard about climate change. How do you build all that together so that people will say, yes, this is the kind of, we do believe we can ramp up our ambition, and these are the kinds of ways that we're going to do it. So we have to be credible with each other about mutual support on finance, about where technology is going. We could invest very strongly in solar and make solar cheaper than a coal-fired power station, even without proper carbon pricing, in the next 6 or 7 years over much of the world. You'll have to couple that with investment in storage too. So there's going to be a big part of this story around innovation and technology, big part of the story around finance and so on. We have to see that the Sustainable Development Goals agreed last month in New York and in the presence of most of the world's leaders, and indeed Pope Francis, that I should underline my multiple references to Pope Francis have nothing to do with my being Catholic. I am not a Catholic, I'm not religious, but I'm just very impressed by what he has managed to do. But the Sustainable Development Goals are a big part of the story of international collaboration around development. And we see also what needs to be done on climate change is part and parcel and fits closely with that. So basically I told a story which is a radical threat, radical change, but that we can combine fighting poverty and creating sustainable growth and climate responsibility. Actually, it's the only way to grow and work to overcome poverty. And I've tried to sketch through technologies, through infrastructure, obviously very quickly, some of the ways in which we might go about that. So I'm enormously optimistic about what we could do. I have to confess I'm rather less optimistic about whether we will do it, but I think it's logically necessary to first establish what you can do, because if you can't establish what you can do, you can't show how attractive that is, how necessary it is. If you can't show those things, then you don't have much chance of persuading people to do it. But, that's my story. I do indeed think we can rise to the two defining challenges of this century, overcoming poverty and managing climate change. We can see our way to do it. What we have to do is to try to work to make what can be done a bit more likely to happen. Thanks very much.
Have been treated to an extraordinary illustration of how looking at similar things in different ways can be equally persuasive, convincing and powerful. There are a few minutes for questions, but I would just like to commence by asking both of you a question, if I may. Lord Stern, one of the planks of your argument and approach has always been that persuasion, as opposed to punishment, is an important part of winning the argument. And it struck me that one of the mechanisms, tools of that is exactly the kind of creative activity which Wolfgang showed us in his pavilion at Milan. You also talked about the importance of creativity in resolving some of the issues, and of course that is something which design does so brilliantly. So I wondered if you might both reflect on how you might be inspired by each other to work together to address these critical challenges.
Well, okay. Well, I suppose to me, when I was younger, I always used to think that art was over there, and science and politics and maths was kind of over there. The older I've come to kind of realise that a lot of these things we're searching for the same thing. We're searching for meaning. We're searching for solutions, and they are independent. They have a relationship. And I think it's a different way of sometimes getting to the same goal. I think maybe how I do sort of things, it's maybe more on an emotional, personal kind of level, because I think sometimes if you can change a sense of consciousness, even by 2 or 3 degrees, in a few years' time you're over there rather than over there. So I think that can change with art, and I think it can change with economics, and I think it can change with politics, and I think the two things can go in tandem.
I would echo that. We are the British Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences, which is a huge, taken together, huge range of intellectual inquiry. But we're next door to the Royal Society, which is the oldest scientific society in the world, and we talk to each other all the time. And those of you who know London, you've got the Mall going from Trafalgar Square to Buckingham Palace. I'm sure you're always travelling from Trafalgar Square to Buckingham Palace. And then just adjacent to that you have Carlton House Terrace and the Duke of York. Well, one side of the Duke of York is the British Academy, Humanities and Social Sciences. The other side is the Royal Society, and about 4 doors along the engineers, British Royal Academy of Engineers. And what we found is it helps by being close to each other. But we talk to each other a great deal. And the subjects about which you talk are these kinds of subjects. But if you're talking about agriculture, if you're talking about bees, all this is about how we behave in relation to the biology and the chemistry and so on, but it's driven in large measure by what we do as human beings, how our society functions and so on. So I think the intertwining of intellectual and creative activity is one of the things that has been going in a good direction. There were times when people thought that they're all separating off and maybe that's the logic of the thing and kind of problems, but never mind. But I really do think that's coming back the other way, and it's driven by the logic, it's driven by the fun, the intellectual creativity and the fun in those things. So I think this was what we saw as an example of sort of people coming out to quite a long way apart in terms of style, but not a long way apart in terms of intellectual approach.
It's a fascinating cluster there because the British Council is at the other end as well, so you've got that whole range, but also communication. There'll be other people with questions, I'm sure. They might like to ask us. Yes, please.
Recently executive director, we have a peace campaign running internationally. We have a climate campaign running, so I have the pleasure to have seen a very different approach on two big issues. I think there's one thing that's in common, in my view. Now bees are in danger because of chemicals. You know, there's a campaign running against the 7 different chemicals that are used in agriculture. So, and we know how our agriculture relies on bees and other bees that are doing the work of you know, it's in the So I think that there's a point of common because we need a radical change in how we use technology. So we need to put bees and protection of bees and life in our way we do agriculture, and sometimes as well as climate. Climate, I think, is an issue of, there are a number of vested interests that are slowing down action, both in two fields, the chemical industry for bees and the energy sector in climate. And so I think that, of course, the art are very powerful, so we should wait some time because I think our campaign can benefit from your work. And I would say also what stand for an environmental activist has changed all the debate in the economics of climate. So we can say there is a debate before Roster and after Roster. I hope that this doesn't mean that you go to like Jesus, we win in Paris. And I have a question for Roster. My impression is that there's a turning point in the technologies that can change the picture. And the turning point is in the automotive industry, is batteries, is how we can have a big change in the transport sector, which is now depending on oil. And my impression is that we are very close to a point where the batteries are maybe becoming competitive. And I know you're an economist, and maybe there is, on our head, there are big money going around in the finance sector. And I think we are close to a point where big money can shift and make a big change. I don't know what's your judgment on that. I think we are close. Maybe it's a time of 2-3 years.
There's a lot in that, so let me pick a few things from what you said. First, I don't think, I know I'm not a campaigner, and I don't think I heard Wolfgang campaigning. What we were doing was exploring an argument, trying to understand and see where that argument went. I'm not a member of any campaign group. I don't sign letters with more than 2 or 3 people on them. And I didn't hear, I mean, Wolfgang can speak for himself, but I didn't hear him campaigning either. What I did hear was someone who can express himself extraordinarily well and help us, through his creativity, understand a set of issues. So I think that's important. And it's important because if you just bang the table and campaign and press, you lose something. And I think we have to take this story where the logic takes us. We have to find ways of expressing ourselves. The political story of campaigning is also very important, but as I say, it's not what I do. But if you think of how ideas changed on drunken driving, I mean, basically we're drunk in charge of the planet, but if you think of drunken driving, that was a combination of evidence. You know, what happens when you drive drunk? Well, you kill people, right? Kill yourself too. But the evidence was very important, just like the evidence on smoking was very important. But at the same time, and this is very much where the politics comes in, you have to find ways of expressing that. And you need different kinds of people to do that. So I think the first point I wanted to make is the difference between analysis and understanding on the one hand, which is vital, key to the story, and the way in which ideas change on the other. And at the end of the last chapter of my book, I tried to struggle with examples, including drunk driving and smoking, about how ideas change. We went from leaded petrol to unleaded petrol. It's very important to understand how those political... I mean, gay marriage was an extraordinarily rapid change as well in many parts of the world. It's very important to try to understand how that political change happens, because if we do have to move very quickly. So that's the first point I wanted to make, the distinction between analysis and exploration on the one hand and leading change on the other. On the technology story, it is amazing how fast it's come. I mean, a Tesla motor cars probably has an inflated capital value, but it's bigger than General Motors. I mean, this is a story of some parts of this becoming very profitable. There are many countries in the world where solar panels in the home already beat the grid-delivered electricity. Not everywhere, of course, just yet. So I do think that technological change is very rapid. I mentioned right at the beginning what Toyota announced yesterday about the way they see in 2050 the structure of their production, and they see hardly any conventional internal combustion engines in that. So it's happening remarkably quickly, and I think much faster than I thought 10 years ago. Can I tell you industry by industry, you know, when all these things are going to overtake? I can't. But let me just leave you with one observation on that, is that when you compare cost, has it become less costly to do it this way? You've got to be very careful to do cost properly. Coal costs, I mean, it depends which coal you buy, but ballpark, coal costs about $50 a tonne. Coal, if you burn it, is 1.9 CO2. A low price, much too low in my view, would be $35 a tonne. Well, that adds close to 70 to your 50. The IMF did a study they published in the spring of this year on hydrocarbons, and for them, using $35 a tonne CO2, the pollution cost, the air pollution cost, came in twice the climate cost. Well, I've got $70 for my climate cost, you know, double that's 140. So that would take you to buying and using coal per tonne being something like $250 or more. So you've got to look at your costs properly. Don't let anybody tell you coal is cheap. Coal is incredibly expensive unless you count human lives now at zero cost and human lives in the future at zero cost. If that's your position, then you need to justify it, and it won't be easy to do.
Well, I think there's some really good points there, but it's about the personal, I think, and the political, and the small things you do as well as the big things. And say, for example, there's areas of California now where they actually fly in bees from Australia to pollinate the almonds, because the bees there just don't exist, you know, because of the road, because there's no hedgerows, there's no nothing. So to fly in bees from halfway across the planet is just complete madness. And I think one of the comforting things at the moment is actually bees, because it's become more fashionable, I think, because people kind of realise to make a bigger sort of connection with nature. Bees are actually kind of healthier now in cities than they are actually in the countryside, because there is more biodiversity. You know, there aren't so many sort of pesticides. So I think there are lots of lessons, I think, to be kind of learned in the small and the personal sort of things you can do. And I think you can do that on a personal level, and it's doing those little ripples. And I think if you do change kind of what's in your heart and how you kind of act, then you can make the bigger things. But I think it's a combination, I think, of the big steps and the small steps.
Ambassador.
Hello, thank you. Could I first say that I spent 20 minutes quietly in the beehive in Wolfgang's structure last night, trying to just take a last look in the night at what you created, and it was absolutely inspiring. So thank you so much for that. And it wasn't just the inspiration of being there, it was also the inspiration of watching the enjoyment of all the hundreds of people pouring through and watching it. That was just a tremendous experience. It's been a huge success, so thank you all.
Thank you.
My question is about the argument, the connection that you've established between how tackling climate change and growth, and maintaining growth and countering poverty in the world has been, you've developed an argument for those two to be put forward in parallel. Is there a policy that needs to be promoted really to change our ideas of growth? Because if we're going to share growth globally, it's actually going to be, we're going to have to adjust our expectations for how we live. And are our governments doing enough on that? I mean, they're having to be persuaded to take it seriously and that it's manageable, that they can achieve political aims, whether it's in the developing world or the developed world, and tackle climate change at the same time. But are they persuading global populations that actually the aspiration for how we live has got to change? Because it seems to me that we are going to, all of us, have to live differently. And we're not being told that or told how.
I think we're moving quite quickly in that direction, but nowhere near quickly enough. If you think about how people treated waste and litter, I'm just looking around, like probably one of the oldest people in the room, but if you think back to the 50s and 60s, of how we treated air pollution, how we treated waste and litter in different places around the world, those have changed. We don't think it's clever or sensible or productive to pollute rivers and throw waste in the street. London in the 50s was full of smog. I had to walk home from school sometimes because they took the buses off the road because you couldn't see more than 3 meters. They gave you a stomach pump when you fell in the Thames because it was so polluted. Now you see cormorants fishing in the Thames, and you can at least see in London, although there's lots of air pollution you can't see. Now, I don't want to say that we're in some kind of environmental nirvana, because I just spent some time saying how many people died of air pollution in the UK. But I do think those ideas are changing. You see many more city centres which are pedestrian. I think you start to see, you've got a congestion charge in London, you've got more of those in different parts of the world. I think you're starting to see people understand that doing things differently is really rather attractive and is about increasing your standard of living in a reasonably broad but not terribly subtle idea of standard of living. So I do think that's moving. But I set out the urgency in what I had to say. It's not moving fast enough. The second point I would make is it's not just top down. Lots of people are discovering different ways of doing things and sharing them with each other. It is a lot of this discovery of how you do things differently is bottom up. You have all kinds in villages and small towns around the world, people doing car sharing, people doing recycling. And a lot of what we've described is about how communities function. You can't have public transport or car sharing without a community, and an awful lot of recycling and reusing, and people start to talk about circular economy. That's about the ways in which communities function. So I think some of this, indeed a good part of this, comes from the bottom up. You see cities around the world in many ways moving rather more rapidly than countries. So some of this, big parts of this, are bottom up as well as top down. In a case, if you like, in cities, if you want to push that metaphor a bit hard, cities in the middle, and it goes from downwards and upwards. So I think that it's crucial that you have leadership. It's crucial that you have public discussion. It's crucial that firms start to behave in different ways. And perhaps that's something we should talk about too, is how quickly firms are changing. But I can make it sound optimistic, but let me always come back. It's moving, but it's not moving anywhere near fast enough. But it is a different way of living, but it's not hair shirts. It's not sort of depriving yourself. It's not beards and sandals, no objection to beards.
Nothing wrong with that. I usually have sandals on, actually.
Yeah. I've got lots of sandals, but I don't. Anyway, probably shouldn't go too far. But what I'm saying is that we're talking about more attractive ways of living. We're not talking about slashing and cutting, just doing things very differently, breaking the link between consumption and production on the one hand, and the pollution and destruction on the other.
I think there's one question there which might be unanswered.
Good evening. Professor Stern, you stressed the crucial role that both politicians and finance can have to foster this change. And I would like to know which of the two, according to your opinion, has the most challenges to go in that direction.
I'm not sure I should be forced into taking this choice, but I think some ways finance is changing quite quickly. Let me give the example of AP4, which is a big Swedish pension fund, and they've decided to work on decarbonising the portfolio. Been doing that for 3 or 4 years. It's a very big fund. And what they do is industry by industry, they're very big, so they'll hold perhaps a few airlines, a few cars, firms, a few retail companies, and they just look at them and they rank them because they're in a position to require information from them because they're very big, and they sell the worst, in this case particularly in relation to carbon, but not just carbon. They sell the worst and they say why. Their risk return has gone up, and they've started to influence some of the behaviour. So that's the kind of way in which finance can work. I raised the issue of working to bring down interest rates, which are in many cases high for the firm or the company, to do with uncertainty in the structuring of the market rather than, as it were, the underlying cost of capital or the inherent uncertainty in the project that's being considered. So I think there's lots that finance can do, and it's starting. The politics side is made more difficult by short time horizons. And I think that's why it's so important to be convincing about the better growth, the better climate story, why it's so important to have stronger examples of how that works. If you force me to choose, I'd say probably the politics is more difficult than the finance, but I think both are manageable with good arguments and good leadership and good examples.
Okay. Well, I think we should perhaps draw our evening to a close. I'm extremely grateful to everybody for being here and to our two speakers. We obviously wish everyone well at forthcoming COP. I think we'd all like to come and see your bees and in their cello.
You're invited next week.
Very good. So we have at least 2 dates in our calendar, one close and one a little further out. It's been wonderfully inspiring here at BSR to recognise some of the underlying reasons why some of us, at any rate, have spent the past 6 months under an awful lot of scaffolding. The scaffolding is there to reduce our energy costs and make our small contribution to this debate. But all of us go out, I'm sure, inspired to think harder and do more in this critical area. So, Wolfgang Buttress, Lord Stern, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.